And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage. And you're joining us today on the podcast, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. And today, my guest is Julian Birkinshaw, who joins us from the other side of the pond, as we say. He's a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship and the Deputy Dean of Executive Education and Digital Learning at the London Business School. He's a fellow of the British Academy. He has a PhD and MBA degrees in business from the Richard Ivey School of Business, Western Canada, and a BSc from the University of Durham, UK. He's a recognized thought leader on the impact of digital technology on strategy and organization of established companies. I could go on and on, but he's the author of 15 books, including Mind Tools for Managers. He's part of the Thinkers 50 top thought leaders group in the management category. And you could frequently hear him being quoted on CNN, the BBC, The Economist, and others. So welcome aboard today, Julian. How are you today?
I'm pretty good. Thanks, Peter.
Great. So clearly you're coming at this in terms of, you're an academic, correct?
Right.
And there are lots of academics that are in the thought leadership space. So sort of maybe tell us the story of sort of how those things are connected and where they're very different in terms of the things that you do as a thought leader versus the things that one typically does as an academic.
Yeah. I mean, you know full well that academia is all about publishing your academic insights for academic colleagues. And I played that game and I played it successfully for 25 years. But all the way through, really from my PhD in Canada, I was never content just to tell a story to, 20 people who happen to be working in my field. It felt that if you're going to study the topic of management and business, you need to try to influence the practice of management and business. So I wrote case studies for my doctoral thesis, whereas most people do huge data set analysis. And those case studies became teaching case studies for my students. And then they quickly became things which found their way into Harvard Business Review type articles. So I've always kind of ridden two horses when it comes to doing research to say, is there a story here for my academic friends? And is there a story that the business world actually cares about? And that's been the kind of constant philosophy.
So I want to touch on that for a little bit because I've worked over the years with many academics, right? And the subset of academics that can actually pull off that crossover into the general thought leadership, general business world are actually quite small. When you think about it, there are names, the Gary Hamels that come to mind, the Stu Friedmans, et cetera. There's the names that bubble up. But when you look at sort of the total population, the crossover is very, 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 very small.
Completely right.
And I think, you touched on one of the reasons why is, one reason could be some of them are just not interested. They're doing what they're doing as professors. That's cool. But I think the key piece is almost a translation problem of the standards of publishing in academia. Not only is the distribution small, but the way those articles are written are generally unreadable for the general business audience.
No, I mean, it is completely impossible for a general business person to pick up an academic article on business and get anything out of it. And I think it's almost by design. Academia is this profession where we love the mystery and the obfuscation around clever statistical games and things like that. So that is a problem. It's a real problem for the field.
Right. So you've been able to crack the code to some degree. I mean, you mentioned case studies. Speak for a moment, if you would, to the academics or the budding academics, sitting out there and guide them on how to increase their relevance to the general business audience. Because, by the way, that's where impact happens and dollars happen. And
absolutely. And for a big chunk of that group, not all, but the big chunk, the idea that they might actually impact the world of business in a positive way is something that they actually want to do. I mean, they get a little bit socialized into this narrow academic view, but many of them want to do that. So what is the code here? It is, I mean, and it's going to sound a bit obvious, but part one is you start with a fundamentally interesting business problem. And that sounds obvious, but many academics continue to do narrow kind of building another brick on the wall studies that are interesting only to the academic.
So I want to push on that because I think it's a bit of stating the obvious, but not quite, right? So when choosing to research something in academia, it's almost like the narrower the better, and you have to find something someone hasn't quite done before, as opposed to asking who cares? Does it needs to be done? Does it need to be done? Who benefits from it, et cetera? It's very much I'm not saying introspective, but there's a bit of navel gazing there.
Completely.
And I think what you said before is relevant of, okay, why would the business world care about this problem? Forget about the format, but why is this something they're struggling with?
That's right. And if you as an academic, as a PhD student, let's say, spend all your time reading the literature, you identify, as it were, holes in the body of literature, which are almost by definition incremental improvements on what's gone before. If, however, you play I'm going to call it an arbitrage game here, because if you actually sit partly in the world of academia, but you also sit partly in the business world, you can kind of go back and forth between the two and say, hang on, I'm seeing this in the real business world in practice, and these academics aren't even talking about this. Why? That is the essence of an interesting problem, right? And so my advice to the budding academic gurus is that they need to get out more. They need to literally go out and spend time, really working with executives, talking about the problems they're facing and trying to figure out what puzzles they're grappling with, which the academic literature has kind of ignored.
So I'd love to get your feedback on what I call my Switzerland strategy, right? So oftentimes what I see in the marketplace is you have, if you think of it on a continuum, academics on one side,
Yep.
where the validity of the research and such is done to the 11th decimal point, and you can't argue with it, right? Like they make a solid case, the data is there to support it, case closed. On the other side of the house, you might have other types of thought leaders. Maybe they come from business or consultancies or whatever, and they're coming at it from the experiential, meaning, hey, I know when I do a product launch at a CPG because I've done it 10 times. These are the 5 things to look for, right? And what happens is instead of trying to help one another and in a neutral way, the consultants throw mud at the academics and say, yeah, that's all great in the laboratory, but you wouldn't know a client if they fell in your lap. And the academics, sling the mud back and say, oh, yes, but, your theory has no validity because you just pulled it out of your, pick an orifice or whatever. So could you comment on that?
Yeah. So look, they both got a point, and I've been part of those conversations many a time. My answer, as it were, to the consultants is, look, you need to be a little bit more cautious, or at least disciplined, in thinking through what you're saying. And I don't mean that they should become academics. I think what I do mean by that is that it is very easy to generalize from a single example. But very often it's the case that there is some decently collected evidence out there which would lead you to a different conclusion. So I would love our consultant friends to just read a little bit more of this stuff, just to make sure that they don't make silly generalizations. I'll give you one example.
Yep.
We talk about Generation Y, right? The millennial generation. Well, it's actually complete nonsense.
Right.
To talk about that generation as distinctive from Generation X. And I'm not trying to say there's no broad things that we could say about it, but to somehow pigeonhole an entire generation as different from Generation X does not stand up to any sort of scientific scrutiny. Now, we can identify patterns over time, but it's a great example where the academic literature, the academics are furious at these consultants who talk about Gen Y as if they're distinctive. So that's one example where
No, that's a great point. That's a great point. If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. Let me ask you to comment on this. So when I see that problem in my client, whether that client's a consultant or an academic, I actually advise them to say, learn from the other. So if you're a consultant and maybe it's your intuition, your gut, your life experience, et cetera, that leads you to believe that X is true.
Yeah.
That's great. Then I'll say, you know what? There's probably somebody else that studied that in academia or elsewhere. Let's go find some data and attribute to them. So for example, I've had clients come to me and they say, oh, I've got this thing. And it's like, actually, that's called the growth mindset. And there's Professor Dweck at Stanford that's done that. You should read up on hers, A, so you don't sound like naive or ignorant, and then B, attribute to her. Right, because instead of you saying it from ignorance, you say, "Hey, here's," and then according to the work of Dweck or whoever it is, and then I say the reverse to my academic friend, saying, "Okay, let's go find a case study or two in the business world that validates your theories." And to me, I think you need to be buttoned up on both sides because you never know who you're talking to on the client side.
No, I mean that is That is completely right. And whatever your audience, whether you're a consultant, whether you're a keynote speaker, there are different ways of convincing people of things. And some people like numerical
Yep.
data, and some people like just a really neat story. And and the best speakers, the best persuaders, have both tools at their disposal. So I'm completely in agreement on this. But it's a tough act. And to go back to one of your earlier questions, what's the advice? I mean, the skills of writing, let alone speaking, writing to these two different audiences are extremely different, and you have to build a certain ambidexterity, if you don't mind that expression, just in terms of just being able to write in these two completely different ways.
Yeah, and communicate to the different audiences. Yeah, cool. I want to talk for a moment, if we could, about publishing.
Yeah.
Right. So I think I would be remiss if I didn't, given you've written 15 books,
Yeah.
as well as been in a lot of short form. Tell me what your thinking or strategy is for publishing. And again, not academic, but we're talking more sort of thought leadership to get into the quote broader world, the real world.
Indeed, and for me as an academic, Harvard Business Review is still
Of
the
course,
top of the
right.
tree when
Yep.
it comes to. But we also have things like Sloan Management Review
Yep.
and a thing called California Management Review, which are in the slightly more kind of crossover world. I mean, I've published in Harvard Business Review, I guess, half a dozen times. I mean, what they're looking for, as I think for well, is they're looking for that dash of insight that says, everyone else thought, that the sky was blue, and in fact, the sky is green. And here is my little piece of evidence and a couple of nice stories to persuade you of that. And I've probably submitted 20, 30 sort of proposals to Harvard Business Review over the year. They reject 3/4 of them. I'm kind of cool with that. And I'm just always looking for a fresh angle, right? I mean, that's, I know that the underlying research I'm doing is sound. I know I'm writing interesting stories about what companies are doing, and you're just trying on, different angles with them all the time. So I wrote a thing on learning from failure, right? I mean, everybody says if you want innovation, you've got to get more serious about tolerating failure. And they soundly rejected my original proposition because everybody else basically said that. And then at some point in the conversation with them, we came up with this notion of what we called a return on failure, a ratio, if you like, between the benefits of failure and the costs of failure.
Right. Just a bit of a different angle.
Yeah, it's nothing more than a new angle on an old problem, which just gave us a little bit of a wedge to get some of the case studies and stories and ideas across.
So you say, based on your experience, because there's sort of I wouldn't call it a formula, but we know the attributes, the things that Harvard Business Review, as an example, is looking for. There's got to be data, et cetera. And given that you've got a fairly good batting average, right? Any trend or anything non-obvious that bubbles to the top of, hey, this 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever that I got published, there seems to be a common something, or is luck and charm?
I mean, well, luck and tenacity for sure. I mean, the one I just mentioned was actually officially rejected, I think, at least twice before we prized open the door a third time. No, look, I think if you can't express your idea in a paragraph, I mean, ideally in a couple of sentences, but in a single paragraph, then I think you're dead.
Okay.
Because the thing to remember with HBR is that even when you've got a relationship with them, they're reading dozens of proposals every
of course, right.
every day, and they simply are looking for a reason to reject. And unless you can hook them in that first couple of sentences of the proposition, then you haven't got a hope. And of course, the other thing that they're then looking for is real evidence that there's a story there. In other words, they don't just want the neat idea; they want at least one example or pretty solid body of data that says that there's some truth behind that. So those are the two tips that I always give to my friends who say they want to publish in Harvard Business Review.
Excellent. So I want to switch now, if we could, for a moment, to sort of the third leg in the stool of Julian, which is the consulting work that you do with real companies, right? So
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit, not so much the type of work, but how does an academic, I wouldn't say find the consulting work, but what are the type of consulting engagements that you're looking for, and how do they come to pass?
Yeah, I mean, there's the bread and butter we call it consulting, but it's actually executive education. The bread and butter work is I will go in and spend a day with a senior team or a group of high potentials, and we'll work through a set of materials. And it's often badged as executive training or development, and fulfilling, interesting stuff. But that is a very different category than the what I would call real consulting work, which is company says, we've got a problem that we're working on, and we want you to help us with it. And frankly, in those latter situations, what I'll typically do is I will act as an advisor to a senior group. So I'm not going to name the company if that's okay,
Sure.
but a very large healthcare provider in Europe, one of the biggest companies in Europe. I sat on their advisory group for their entire sort of innovation process, and for about 2 years, I would go over there every 3 or 4 months, and I would sometimes give them some ideas, and sometimes I would sort of help them review what progress they've been making. And I'd say, do you want to, you should do more of this or a little bit more of that, and you're missing that opportunity. And of course, those sort of advisory opportunities are very sort of fulfilling, because you can see that you're really making a difference. But the flip side of it, of course, is that it's a much bigger time commitment than a lot of academics are prepared to make. And and I guess thinking it through, the third model is, and many of my colleagues have done this, is you actually set up a company on the side, and you then hire a professional colleague who's then doing the kind of the leverage bit. It's not just me and mine. And I've chosen not to do that. Building a company is a lot of work.
So I want to play back something you said, because it's a little bit different than what I typically hear. Is the way you sort of responded was, yes, there's this bucket of work that's really consulting work.
Yeah.
And then, from there you can choose, do you want to, do all the heavy lifting yourself or partner with others? Because there's, there's a cadence that's fairly quick relative to academia. There's, decks and deliverables, and there's a lot of work, right? And then the other piece, which I don't hear much, and which is really interesting, is, they're calling it executive education, coaching, at the root of it, an academic is a teacher. Right. And I think often they're not selling themselves or positioning themselves into the corporate world to teach their people. Right. So if you're at London Business School, which I'd argue one of the top business schools in Europe, and you've got a top leadership team, why wouldn't I want the best from the best to teach my people X, Y, or Z? Right. And that's really interesting to me. I mean, it might seem obvious, but I see.
No, it's a good point, because, what have I spent the last 25 years of my life doing? It is becoming extremely accomplished, if you like, at teaching about taking a group of people on a journey. Sometimes it's a half day, sometimes it's a whole week, to embed a set of principles and to figure out how to learn, how to do something differently as a result. And that's a particular skill set, which, even a lot of consultants don't completely master. So I do sometimes wonder we sell ourselves a little bit short, because, a company will bring us in to do executive education. They bring McKinsey in to do a transformation program, and they charge, McKinsey charges 10 times as much as we do, right?
Yep.
and we haven't been quite as smart, I think, as we could have been about figuring out the real value that we provide to companies in that respect.
Right. So just being able to go with them and saying, just on the teaching side is an interesting way in the door. And then, to your point on the consulting side, yes, people underestimate how much work is involved in being a consultant. But I think the key point there is you need to decide as the provider, how much of that work do you want to do, right? I mean, some models are the academic, sort of the rock star brings in the business and does the client management, but others underneath them are following a framework or methodology that's pretty solid.
Yep.
And the academic's not really doing a lot of the heavy lifting. They're guiding. They would be acting as a senior client engagement manager or something in the McKinsey world. Yeah. Interesting. All right, as we start to wrap up here, Julian, this is we can go for hours, because this is a lot of fun, a lot of insight here. Any final words or thoughts based on what you're doing? Because needless to say, it's working both on the academic side and on the corporate side. Any final reflections?
I think the final reflection is a very personal thing. Is that trying to continue to ride both horses is hugely difficult, and I've seen many of my colleagues. Gary Hamel is one of those people. He's a good friend of mine. Gary stopped publishing, shall we say, academic articles quite a while ago, right? I mean, he's still very well regarded in the academic world, but he's now firmly in the world of consulting and thought leadership. And for me, the challenge, the opportunity cost, if you like, of staying within the academic writing community is huge. And and I've managed to kind of stay on both sides up until now. But I can see that I'm heading, shall we say, the Gary Hamel route in the latter years of my career, because it's just almost impossible to do those things. In fact, you'd be struggling to find more than about 2 or 3 people on that Thinkers 50 list who are still publishing proper academic articles, and that is the biggest.
Well, just based on the demands of what that, if you've committed 1,500 hours of your year to that, there's not a lot left.
That is exactly right.
Yeah, well, this has been great. I appreciate your time and your candor, and I think there was a lot of amazing insights for people on both sides of the house. Because at the end of the day, it's when we bring it all together that the most powerful results happen. So, thank you so much for joining us today, Julian.
You're most welcome. Thanks very much.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.